Well, hello. So good to have the opportunity to continue our study in the miracles of Jesus. We got the opportunity over the past 2 days to look at the first two miracles that are recorded for us in the Gospel of John, which appear to be the first two chronological miracles that we see. Today we're going to get out of the Gospel of John. John is obviously a little bit different than the other three Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are often referred to as the Synoptic Gospels. They're very similar to one another. They're very parallel in a lot of the stories they tell. And so in those miracle accounts, we're going to talk a lot about how the different authors are using these miracles. Some of them are going to be sometimes in slightly different orders. So we're going to tend to utilize the order of events in Luke. Luke is the one who seems to be the most concerned with chronologically going through all of these things. And so John will be kind of treating it as a special case for most of those. Most of his miracles are only in his gospel with one or two exceptions. So we're going to be doing things a little bit differently. Like I said, trying to harmonize these four gospels is a monumental task. It has been done many times over, and it continues to be a work in progress, continues to be something that people work very hard at doing. And so we're going to try to do that in a very limited way with the miracles, but also continue to see how they're working in each individual gospel as well as together. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the first miracle recorded for us in both the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke, and that's going to be the healing of the demoniac in the synagogue at Capernaum. We had mentioned that Capernaum kind of serves as the early base of operations for Jesus and the disciples. It seems to have been where many of the disciples were working as far as the fishermen in Galilee, and it seems to have been kind of an early hub for activity. And so many of the next miracles that we're going to be talking about take place in this Capernaum city and in the region of Galilee at large. And so to kind of place ourselves in the context, and this is really important, both in Mark, which is a much more abbreviated account. Luke gives us some of the nativity gospel. It gives us some of the early discussions of Jesus, some of the things that occur in his childhood. Mark slams right through some stuff. Within just the first couple of verses, you're already into the midst of Jesus' ministry. And so Luke expands a lot more on these things, but they both kind of follow the same path of what's going on in this miracle. And so what's important to note is that before this miracle takes place in Capernaum, there's a very important event taking place in Luke chapter 3. Actually, excuse me, it's actually going to be in Luke chapter 4. And Luke chapter 4 is where we're going to be taking the majority of our text from today. And so in Luke chapter 4, after John the Baptist ministry has been recorded for us in Luke, after Jesus himself has been baptized, and then we get this genealogy that goes through the line of Christ all the way back to Adam, confirms for us he is the heir to all these promises to David, to the tribes of Israel, to Abraham, to all these groups of people. In chapter 4 and verse 1, we are said that Jesus, filled with the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led around by the Spirit in the wilderness for 40 days, being tempted by the devil. And so this is a really big event in the Gospels, is this 40-day period in the wilderness. It obviously is paralleling the 40 years spent in the wilderness by Israel. It's also paralleling the 40 days in the wilderness that Elijah spends at Horeb and in the wilderness. But this, we often read of this as the temptation of Jesus. That's actually the word that we just read. That word there actually kind of has a dual meaning. It can mean the idea of temptation, but it can also mean the idea of testing. And so what we're seeing very clearly is that this is not just Satan, but this is also God testing his son, testing Jesus in the same way that Israel was tested in the wilderness. The big difference, though, is that Jesus is going to be successful. Jesus is going to stay faithful. But we know what occurs in this story. The Satan, the adversary figure, appears, and this is one of the few times we actually, for as major a participant in the biblical story as the Satan is, he really doesn't appear that often explicitly. Now, almost every single wicked action in the Bible you can attribute to Satan's influence or the influence of the demons. But there's actually very few instances where Satan himself appears and actually interacts with human beings or even other angels. And so here we have the Satan appears to Jesus. And Mark's account is very, very short. It really just says that Jesus and Satan have this conflict. Luke gets into the details of what are actually occurring here and how the Satan figure is tempting Jesus. And the reason you may be picking up, I'm saying the Satan. The word shaitan, which is where we get Satan, it's not a name. It's a title. It's the adversary. So we're never given a name of exactly who the Satan is, like we do have in angels like Gabriel or Michael. And so there's a lot of names that have been tossed around from, I think, misinterpretations of the Bible. But the adversary, that's the title of who Jesus is facing here. And so you'll sometimes hear me say the Satan. And so the Satan tempts Jesus based off of his relationship with the Father, his filial loyalty to Yahweh. And so he tempts him with this identification in verse 3. It's already noted that Jesus has been wandering. He has not been eating during these days, and so he's very hungry. And it said, the devil said to him, if you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become bread. And Jesus answered and said, it is written, man shall not live on bread alone. And so we see that Jesus is being tempted to rely upon his power ultimately for selfish means, fill your belly with the food. We then see that he's tempted by taking him up, and the Satan figure shows him all the kingdoms of the world. And remember, the devil is in control of these things. The devil is the prince of this earth. While he is subordinated and under subjection to God, he does have a measure of authority. He does have a measure of rule in this world. And he says, I'll give you all this domain and its glory, for it has been handed over to me, and I give it to whoever I wish. Therefore, if you worship before me, it shall all be yours. And it's almost like this is kind of like a gentleman's agreement, almost kind of like a peace treaty of, listen, if you'll submit to me, I will let you, Jesus, rule through all of these things. Instead of us fighting through this, let's come to an agreement here. We can work this out, and you can still get what you want. Because Jesus is coming, as we're going to talk a little bit more about, to be the king. He is coming for his coronation, ultimately for his lifting up. It's going to take a very different form than what we would often think of coronation, but he's coming to be crowned king. And Jesus, we know, answered him, it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only. And then he's taken up to the pinnacle. He's taken up to the high portico of Solomon's temple, or Herod's temple, and Satan tempts him, if you're the Son of God, throw yourself down, because the scriptures say that you will be protected. And Jesus answered and said to him, it is said, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. And then a really important verse here. When the devil had finished every temptation, he left him until an opportune time. So the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness, the testing of Jesus in the wilderness, is not the end of the conflict between Jesus and between Satan. It's actually going to continue all through the gospel accounts. And so all of these healing miracles where Jesus is exorcising demons from people, it's important to read that in the context of an ongoing struggle between Jesus and between Satan. That Satan recognizes that Jesus has come to defeat him. Jesus has come to save mankind. Jesus has come to ultimately put an end and a destruction to the rebellion that Satan started all those thousands of years ago. And so Satan recognizes that he has to do something to stop Jesus. So what we're going to see is that there's going to be multiple miracles in all four of the Gospels where there is a conflict between Satan and between Jesus, or between Satan's demons and between Jesus. And so it's with that in mind that we then skip a little bit down. Jesus begins his public ministry. He first goes to Nazareth and is mostly rejected. They actually try to kill him, and he ends up walking through the crowd either magically or charismatically. And we then see that he goes to Capernaum. So he goes from his hometown of Nazareth. He's rejected there. Prophet has no honor. And then he goes down to Capernaum. And in verse 31, it says, he came down to Capernaum, a city of Galilee, and he was teaching them on the Sabbath. And they were amazed at his teaching, for his message was with authority. In the synagogue, there was a man possessed by the spirit of an unclean demon, and he cried out with a loud voice, let us alone. What business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. But Jesus rebuked him, saying, be quiet and come out of him. And when the demon had thrown him down in the midst of the people, he came out of him without doing him any harm. And amazement came upon them all, and they began talking with one another, saying, what is this message? For with authority and power he commands the unclean spirits, and they come out. And the report about him was spreading into every locality, in the surrounding districts. All right, so in order to fully understand what's going on here, we do have to have a little bit of cultural context of what's going on. We live in a very non-supernatural culture. By and large, our culture, and sometimes this even infects Christian thinking, is one that doesn't think much about a spiritual realm. It's one that doesn't think much about the activities of angels and demons and of God working his way in the world. By and large, you would see most people don't believe that that occurs. The Jewish world did not have that mindset. They were very, perhaps for lack of a better term, in tune with the spiritual realm. And so even before Jesus comes on the scene, there is a lengthy tradition of Jewish exorcists, of the priest and of Levites and of different people exorcising demons out. And there was very specific cultural ways to do that. And oftentimes it was long, liturgical, spell-heavy things. And there was all sorts of books and manuscripts and methodologies written about how you could exorcise a demon. And so it was a lot of calling on different names and a lot of the idea of identifying the demon and that identification of the demon giving power over the demon. And so you would then be able to say, in the name of God, I cast you out. And so it was a very complicated, lengthy process. It doesn't always work. And so it's a very, very mystical area of Judaism. And so the First Testament Christians would know that background, particularly readers of the Gospels that are already a little bit inundated into that culture. They would already have that background in mind when they're reading this account. And so when we read this actually kind of changes a little bit how we read the demon's response. And as a side note, isn't it fascinating and terrifying that there's a demoniac in the synagogue? Because when we think of demon possession, we often think of, the Hollywood depiction of your head is spinning around in circles and steam is coming out of your ears and you get gross and deformed and everything like that. But this demoniac is just in the synagogue. And the fact that Jesus is teaching on the synagogue on the Sabbath, this demoniac is there while Jesus is teaching. And the text doesn't exactly tell us what's going on with this. We don't know if the Galileans just don't really care about the demoniac being there. Perhaps they're so desensitized to it that they're just aware that, crazy Maurice sits back there and does his thing. Or maybe they're unaware that this guy is demon-possessed. Maybe this guy has just been going around his daily business. And certainly there are accounts of demoniacs where, they're scratching themselves and they become supernaturally strong. And it's very obvious that they're possessed by demons. But even in the scriptures, when Judas has Satan enter into him, I don't think it becomes super obvious because none of the other disciples know what's going on. They don't see Judas come and be like, oh, Judas is coming with the Romans. This is really bad. We know he's demon-possessed. Judas walks right up to them. He kisses Jesus on the cheek, and they're still confused as Jesus is being hauled away about what all's going on. So demon possession doesn't always look super obvious. So is it possible that this demoniac has been worshiping and with the Galileans and with the people in Capernaum? It could be that this is a really bad sign of the spiritual state of Capernaum. And so we don't know exactly what's going on, but I think that's fascinating that there's a demoniac just amongst the people and nobody makes a big deal about it. Nobody asks for him to be healed. Nobody asks for him, hey, before we get teaching, there's this guy who's very clearly demon-possessed. It's very weird that nothing is said about that. But anyway, with that in mind, that this is kind of an odd situation, the demoniac actually self-identifies himself. He's the one who actually starts this conversation. He cries out with a loud voice. It's a shriek. It's a scream. It would be the equivalent of somebody just starting to scream in the middle of church worship. You can imagine how disorienting that would be, how odd that would be. And he cries out, let us alone. What business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? And so again, we see the demon is speaking here. This is the demoniac voice. He is identifying Jesus of Nazareth. He says, if you come to destroy us, I know who you are, the Holy One of God. We often read that in the light of, for an example, a passage in James where James mentions that, the demons believe and shudder. They recognize who Jesus is. And we kind of read into that, okay, this must be the demon pleading for mercy. This is him recognizing who Jesus is and begging for mercy. There is a little bit of oddity to that, though, because if he knows who he is, and he even says, have you come to destroy us? If he knows who Jesus is, he knows he's the Son of God, he knows he's an unclean demon who is antithetical to Jesus, is he begging for mercy here? Would he expect mercy to be coming here? Or, if we just talked about the ideas of these Jewish possession ideas, of the Jewish ideas of exorcism, where naming held power, is it possible that the demon is actually trying to exercise authority over Jesus? By naming him the Holy One of God, by naming him as Jesus of Nazareth, from a Jewish perspective, this is the demon trying to attack Jesus, trying to gain control over Jesus. But look how Jesus responds. Jesus does not go into, from a Jewish perspective, the extensive exorcism. He doesn't go through these things. He says, be quiet and come out of him. In Greek, it's 5 words. It's very brief. It's very concise. It's essentially, shush and get out of here. Leave. There's no fight. There's no great dramatic struggle for who's going to win this. It's over. And the Mark account makes the comment that the demon is tormented by this, that he throws the man into one final epileptic fit, this convulsion, and then he screams out once more. He cries out, and he throws him down in the midst of the people. As Luke says, then he came out of him without doing him any harm. And so what we're seeing here is a conflict between the demon, between Satan, who we've just read is looking for an opportune time to attack Jesus, to tempt him again. And this demon tries to attack him, tries to engage with him, and is utterly defeated. And so what we're seeing here is that Luke and Mark are both building the narrative of Jesus as the conqueror, as Jesus as the victor in his battles against the spiritual forces of darkness. And that's a really important theme that's going to go throughout the Gospels, is that Jesus is the servant, Jesus is a physician, Jesus is the Savior, but Jesus is also a conqueror. Jesus is also a king coming to defeat those who have laid claim on his kingdom. His enemies are those who are the direct servants of Satan in the demons, and also those who are indirectly the servants of Satan, those who are repressing the righteous, those who are fighting against his cause. When we see people like the Pharisees and Sadducees, which is why he identifies them as sons of demons. John calls them a brood of vipers. And so what we're seeing in this miracle is that this is more than just an exercise of Jesus' power. This is more than just a demonstration of who he is. It is a recognition that the battle has started, that the war over mankind between Jesus and between Satan is undergoing, but Satan has no ability to defeat him. Between the account of the temptation and between these accounts that we're going to see, this is not a battle between equal forces. This is not a battle between two evenly matched combatants. This is a slaughter. This is an absolute inability of Satan to defeat Jesus. And that's just going to keep on happening as we see these exorcism miracles continue to go about. And so the takeaway for us then is that we oftentimes, again, kind of discredit the power of demons because we don't see that in the same way that a first century culture would have. We, again, live in an anti-supernatural culture. We don't see a lot of evidence of these things. And so for us, the spiritual battles can seem either very far off or very distant in the past. But the reality is that these workings of the spiritual forces are still active. Paul says very bluntly that our fight is against these spiritual forces of darkness. We are still locked in combat. Our victory is assured through Christ, but we need to be aware that this combat is still ongoing. But we also take heart that it's not our power that's going to overcome them. It's the power of Jesus, who from the very beginning was undeterred by the power of these dark forces. So I hope that gives you some things to think about. Like I said, we're going to continue to develop several of these different strands. We're going to see strands of healing. We're going to see threads of exorcism. We're going to see threads of the power of God. But all of these are starting to weave together, and ultimately they bring together a cohesive picture of all of these things coming to reality in the crucifixion. That's ultimately what we're building towards. So hope this gives you some things to think about, some things that are edifying for you as we continue to study these things. We appreciate so much you taking the time to listen to these things, to continue in your study of the miracles of Jesus. We love you guys. We appreciate so much the hard work that everybody is putting in a difficult time. We cannot wait to see you as soon as we can. Thank you so much. We'll see you again next time.